closer to you, Eddie. Right. Okay. Good evening, and welcome to the Forum on Prisons and Sentencing, the controversy over 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, and sentencing policy. My name is Kate Clark, and I'm with the Kennedy School of Government Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management and Harvard Law School's graduate program. It's really an honor to be here this evening with a very distinguished panel. And the issue tonight is sometimes highly politicized, and sometimes it's emotional for those people who deal with prisons and sentencing in many capacities. Many of us tonight already hold very strong opinions about these issues. Yet most of us in the room know very little about how the intricacies of the sentencing process works, the reality of prison life, and the impact that new criminal justice policies have on real people's lives, not just here in the United States, but abroad also. For example, in South Africa, the newest prisons that are cropping up all over the continent of South Africa have been built by an American corporation with American advisors leading the way oftentimes. For example, the CMAX prison in Cape Town is modeled after, almost exactly, the maximum security prison in Texas. Crime is universal. So what we debate this evening is relevant in many other countries struggling with these same concerns. So why do I say few of us really understand the impact of sentencing on persons and in the community? It's because most of us here this evening have never stepped inside a large prison. There are some of us who have stepped inside and have lived in prisons, but most of us here have not. Indeed, most lawyers know little about the impact prisons have on people's lives and their surrounding communities. Some of that impact can be positive. It can provide jobs to a community and other related income sources. I used to teach criminal law and procedure in New Orleans. And each semester I made a point of taking my classes to spend a day with the maximum security prisoners in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. It was certainly an eye-opening experience for most of those future lawyers. Amazingly, many criminal justice professors and most prosecutors and judges have never visited a prison, and thus they never gain a deeper understanding of the places they send people. Despite the enormous growth of the prison industry, most politicians make their decisions based on reports and statistics, gleaned at hearings which often fail to capture the reality of life in prison and the impact on family life. As we begin our debate this evening, please be aware of your limitations, of your current perspective, and listen to each of our panelists with an open mind. Each is a thoughtful and experienced expert in this area. Our first speaker this evening is Eddie Ellis. Mr. Ellis is a writer, a lecturer, and a community activist. He is a former leader of the Black Panther Party who served 25 years in prison, where he acquired a Bachelor of Science from Marist College, a master's degree from the New York Theological Seminary, and several other associate degrees. Eddie Ellis has always maintained his innocence, arguing that he was targeted as a leader of the Black Panther Party for neutralization under the FBI counterintelligence program, which resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. Currently, Eddie Ellis is president of the Community Justice Center in New York City, which is a criminal justice public education agency and advocacy organization. Mr. Ellis is also a research fellow with the Blanche Du Bois Institute for Public Policy at the Medgar Evers College, and he serves on the board of advisors of the New York City Commission on Human Rights and the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, New York. A busy man. He is the criminal justice consultant for the New York State Senator for New York Senator State Seabrook, as well as an advisor to and members of other boards and commissions around the country, and I'll only name 3 because there were too many to list: the National Trust for the Development of African American Men, the Institutional Review Board of the Vera Institute of Justice, and the National Criminal Justice Commission. Our next speaker, some of you know and recognize from other forum events, is Mr. Dan Lundgren, who has been a fellow here at the Institute of Politics for this past semester. He served in the United States Congress for 10 years, and then as the Attorney General of California for 8 years. While in Congress, Mr. Lundgren's accomplishments included the passage of Reagan's 1984 Comprehensive Crime Bill, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, and the anti-drug laws in 1986 and 1988. He served as an influential member of the Judiciary Committee, where he worked on reform of the criminal code. While Attorney General of California, the nation's most populous state, Mr. Lundgren was the major force behind the 3 strikes and you're out sentencing policy. Under his leadership, California implemented its capital punishment law for the first time in a quarter of a century. During his tenure, crime in California fell to a 32-year low. Dan Lundgren has received many awards and honors. In 1996, his colleagues honored him with their highest award, the Wyman Award, which is given annually to the state attorney general who, quote, has done the most to advance the objective of the National Association of Attorney Generals. He received the Angel of Peace Award from the Violence Prevention Coalition of Greater Los Angeles and the Man of the Year Award from the Hollenbrook Youth Center for his strong support of efforts on behalf of inner city youth. And finally, our last speaker is Mark Maurer. He's the assistant director, of the Sentencing Project, a national organization based in Washington, D.C. And the Sentencing Project develops alternative sentencing programs and conducts research on criminal justice issues. Mark has directed programs on criminal justice reform for 20 years. He is the author of some of the most widely cited reports in the fields of criminal justice, including Young Black Men in the Criminal Justice System and Americans Behind Bars. It is a series, and his newest book is Race to Incarcerate. His new book has been described by Kirkus Reviews as meticulously researched rejoinder on the war on crime. Mark has served as a consultant to the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the National Institute of Corrections. He is currently a member of the Bar Association's Committee on Race in Criminal Justice and the Criminal Justice System, and in 1996, he received the Donald Cresley Award for contributions to criminal justice research from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. All of this leads me to pause and say, it is really an honor to be with all of you this evening. But before we begin, very briefly, I just want to make sure that everyone here is at the same place in terms of two terms that will be used often tonight. The first is the mandatory minimum sentences. What is the meaning of that? Most states have passed some form of mandatory minimum law that removes discretion and imposes a minimum number of years for specific offenses. And the second term is three strikes laws. Although each state is different, this term generally refers to the idea of 3 strikes and you're out, meaning that an offender who is found guilty of a third strikeable offense must be sentenced to enhanced penalty, and oftentimes that is 25 years to life or life without parole. The format for the evening is as follows. We are going to forego opening statements, and we are going to dive right into a series of questions, and then depending on how our panelists stick to the time limitations, I'm going to exercise some discretion and allow a little bit of rebuttal, but mostly we would like the audience to ask some probing questions following that. So to begin, I'd like to start with Mark. We've seen a drop in crime in American cities nationwide. Do you think that current trends in sentencing policies, such as the 3 strikes and mandatory minimums, have caused this ongoing drop in crime rates?
In brief, no. I think if we look at trends in prison, trends in crime, it makes sense to look over the last 25 years. And what we've seen over the last 25 years has been truly unprecedented. We've gone from a point where we had 200,000 people in prison. We've since added 1 million additional inmates, 1.2 million now. If you add in local jails, we have nearly 2 million Americans locked up. Now, if one were to look at just the last 7 years, it would be tempting to say that you increase the prison population, as we have, by about 50%, and crime goes down. And you would think that there's a correlation there. It's also true, though, that if you look at the 7 years just prior to that, you had a point where the prison population also went up substantially, and yet crime went up then too. So we don't see any consistent relationship there. I think Mr. Lundgren will probably talk about why he believes 3 strikes and you're out has been very effective in California. The best research in California shows that crime was going down before 3 strikes and it merely continued to go down down, that the kinds of offenders targeted by 3 strikes, their crime rates have not gone down any more substantially than other people. Now, why is crime going down in recent years? It's a complicated story. Nobody knows the whole answer. A lot of it has to do with drugs, I believe. In the mid-1980s, many urban areas, we had the rise of crack cocaine being introduced. You had this new drug markets. Turf battles erupted over people trying to make money off these drugs. A lot of them were teenagers, and they armed themselves with guns, which were readily accessible, and they had a big shootout for a number of years. What happened beginning in the 90s, a lot of that changed. Some of those people were now dead, some were in jail. Many of their younger brothers and sisters looked at what was going on, decided that didn't look like very much fun. They didn't want to get involved in the whole crack trade, crack use, and their rates of using crack declined. Places like Boston here, of course, nationally recognized because police and community groups have worked together to get guns out of communities, to do prevention programs, get the churches involved. It's a whole complex set of things. A good economy helps as well. Basically, if you have a prison system and you're locking up serial rapists, you're bringing some safety to the community. On the other hand, if you're locking up increasingly low-level drug offenders, taking kids off street corners for having 5 grams of crack cocaine, you can lock them up in prison, but as long as there's a demand in the community, somebody else is going to be stepping up to take their place as soon as you lock up that first kid. So you've increased the prison population. We now have 11 times as many people locked up for drugs as we did in 1980, but it doesn't mean you're having an impact on crime when you do that. Finally, let me just say, all of these issues represent a trade-off. Every dollar you put in a prison cell is a dollar you're not putting into community policing, probation officers, Head Start programs, or whatever else we might think would have an impact on crime. So the question is not just, does prison reduce crime, but even if you believe it does it reduce it more effectively in some of these other approaches? I don't believe that it does.
Thank you. Mr. Lundgren?
As you might imagine, I have a different point of view.
Surprise.
I've been involved in this for 20 years, both as a member of Congress and as Attorney General, and while I was a member of Congress on Judiciary Committee, and I have visited prisons and jails, and people who've been in, people who've been out, but I've also visited victims of crime, family members, and I think that's one part of it that you have to talk about as well. You not only have to talk about those who are jailed or those who are imprisoned, you have to talk about those who were victimized by those who were jailed and imprisoned. So it's not just one side. I mean, look, for those people who haven't been into prisons or jails, you're right, there's a lot they have to learn. For people who've never been victimized by crime, you've got a lot to learn. Look what are the protests we had in this local area. University of Massachusetts, what are they protesting? They're not protesting that the people who committed the rape, whoever is committing the rape, didn't get social welfare assistance. They're protesting the fact that they are worried, that their lives are changed in sometimes very real ways, and sometimes ways from which they can never recover by virtue of the fact you've got people out there who are predators. And so I think we ought to recognize from the very beginning, why do we have prisons? Why do we have a criminal justice system? It is because the first duty of government is to create some modicum of safety within which we can live our lives. It is an obligation. It's not just a right. It is an obligation of government as the actor for society to try and protect the innocents from those who would be the predators. And so I think you have to start with that. Is there some relationship between prison sentencing and incarceration and the state of crime? I think that's absolutely true. And I don't go back 25 years, I'll go back to 1950s. At the end of the 1950s in California, it's also across the country, but I know California better, we decided that in fact incarceration didn't work. We followed the suggestions of those now who are saying it's failed. And as a matter of fact, in 1978, there were fewer people incarcerated in California than there were in 1960. Despite the fact that the crime rate doubled during the 60s in California and almost doubled again in the 70s, nearly quadrupling during that period of time. And during that period of time, the number of people in the prisons in California remained the same and slightly less, despite a population that was expanding and despite a almost four times greater rate of crime. In fact, we tried the approach in which we said, incarceration doesn't work. We've got to try something else. Rehabilitation was the #1 precept of the criminal justice system during the 60s and 70s. We had the greatest skyrocketing of crime we'd ever seen. What happened at the beginning of the 80s? or mid-'80s in California, again, I will give you my reference point because I know it best, we changed the criminal justice system. For the first time in history, California threw out 2 members of the California Supreme Court, 3 members, because they felt they, in fact, were going in a too lenient fashion. And we started building prisons again. In 1980, when George Deukmejian first came in, about 1982, we had about 28,000 people in prison in California. We have 160,000 plus now. During that period of time, the crime rate plateaued and then it started down. We thought one of the things we ought to do is create a mechanism by which a significant portion of the criminal justice system went after what are known as career criminals, because there's at least 3 national studies recognized that suggest between 4 and 7% of all criminals commit between 40 and 70% of all crime. And if you target your system at that, you can make exceedingly large chunks, take exceedingly large chunks out of the criminal justice, out of crime. And that's what 3 strikes is all about. As a matter of fact, we have had the greatest drop in crime in the history of California since 3 strikes went into effect. We've had an over 50% drop in murder in California, an overall almost 40% drop in all crimes. When 3 strikes was being considered, one of the great think tanks, Rand Corporation, looked at it and said, it's too expensive. It may work. In fact, in 25 years, it will have a positive impact by dropping crime by 25%. They were right, but they only missed it by 21 years. Within 4 years, we had a 21% drop in crime in California. Do I think it's made a difference? I think it's made a huge difference. Is it the only thing? No. Community-based policing, rehabilitation efforts, whole group of other things, but the most significant single change we've made is in our sentencing policy and our incarceration policy, and it makes the streets safer in the state of California and around the country.
Mr. Ellis, would you like to address this?
It's a tough act to follow. I think when we talk about 3 strikes you're out and mandatory sentencing and these draconian sentencing measures, what we're really talking about is the over-reliance on prisons for some of the most serious societal problems that we have. And if you look at the people who are in the prisons, what you're looking at is a demographic of race and class in America. Rich people, for the most part, don't go to prison. Not that they don't commit a lot of crimes, but they don't wind up in prison. Poor people go to prison. For the most part, white people don't go to prison. People of color go to prison. People who can't afford lawyers. I think it was Johnny Cochran that said that the amount of justice you get in America is commensurate with the amount of money you can spend. And if you can spend a lot of money, you can get a lot of justice. And if you only have a little bit of money to spend, you only get a little bit of justice. And if you don't have any money to spend, well, you got a serious problem. I think that America is not appreciably safer as a result of the massive buildup of incarceration that we've seen over the last 25 years, 20 years. I think that commensurate with the decline in crime, what we've also seen is an enormous decline in the population of people who commit crimes, the demographic population, and particularly the age population. That age population between 16 and 25 that's most likely to commit a crime. So we've seen an enormous decrease in that population, and with that decrease, we've seen a decrease in criminal activity across the board. You have to forgive me, my voice is very hoarse, probably from talking too much and too long. I think also that if you look at people who are in prison, you look at the class of prisoners who's in prison, what you find is 70% of them are nonviolent drug offenders, low-level drug offenders, as Mark points out. Or they're substance abusers, people who have substance abuse problems. And we've taken substance abuse problems, we've treated it as a criminal justice problem, when in fact it should probably be a public health problem. But above and beyond that, I think for me, as a community-based activist and as a person, and I think I'm the only one on the panel that ever did any time in prison, and I spent almost half of my life in prison in New York State. And I can tell you unequivocally that there's nothing that takes place in prison that makes you any safer when I come out than when I went in. In fact, the opposite is true. most men who come out of prison come out in worse shape than when they went in. And it seems to me in New York, and I'm not sure what the figure is in California, but in New York, the recidivism figure is close to 50%. So we're spending approximately $25,000 a year to keep a person in prison for how many ever years. And when he comes out, he's in worse shape than when he went in. Now, if this prison industrial complex was analogous to a corporate structure, we would have a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's got a 50% defective product rate. And it seems to me that in that kind of a context, we're not getting the best bang for our buck, particularly in view of the fact, as Mark points out, that for every dollar we spend on prison, we have $1 less that we have to spend on education. In New York State, for instance, over the last 6 years, we've had a $750 million increase prison spending, prison construction, maintenance, and operating costs. And at the same time, we've had a corresponding $690 million decrease in the budgetary allocation for higher education. So the trade-off is more incarceration, less education. Seems to me if you're going to spend $25,000 to do something with someone, I would rather send them to Harvard than to Attica. And I think that based on my experience in prison, that there is a substantial portion of people who are in prison who would benefit by going to Harvard and who we could turn their lives around. I think that when California abandoned rehabilitation as a viable piece of public policy, it made a very serious mistake. And I think that in the long run, that mistake will come back ultimately to haunt them. I think also that when you put people in prison, unless you're talking about in the California experience, we are talking about 3 strikes, you're out, imprisonment for the rest of your life, and we don't know how much the cost is, $25, and the average $25,000 a year. But what we're really talking about is mortgaging the future, because ultimately, the majority of people in prison coming back out, not going to all stay in there. We can't build enough prisons to keep enough people in prison using that kind of a draconian criminal justice philosophy. I think lastly that kind of philosophy is driven by fear. It's driven by fear of race, it's driven by fear of class, it's exacerbated by media hysteria, and it is compounded by the political divisiveness that we've seen in this country over the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years or so with regard to the criminal justice question. I think that America has always needed boogeymen. And for a long time, the communists were the boogeyman. And if you weren't a good person, we'd stick the communists on you. And the communist threat provided some sense of national unity. We could all rally around defeating communism. And then after we defeated communism, we needed another boogeyman. And the criminal has become that boogeyman. And when we use that term criminal, a certain kind of image comes to mind. And that image is generally an inner city kid who's Latino or black, who's in his teenage years, who's got on some baggy jeans and some Nike sneakers and a Chicago Bull hat turned backwards. And that has become our new boogeyman. That has become the symbol of everything that's, I guess, wrong with America. And if we can only contain this boogeyman and lock him or her up for a long enough period of time, everything will be right with America. And I just fail to see how, having had a personal experience in the prison, I fail to see how that kind of public policy could lead to anything ultimately but real serious consequences.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, we're going to start with a question that actually Mr. Ellis has already raised, and perhaps you can think about ways to fix the issue you have raised. The Bureau of Justice Statistics has recently reported, based on current rates of incarceration, that an estimated 28% of black males will enter state or federal prison during their lifetime, compared to 16% of Hispanic males and 4.4% of white males. Is this reflective of a strong racial bias in sentencing policies or practices?
It's a combination of factors, I believe. First of all, people have to come into the criminal justice system. So how do they come in? Well, it seems from the best information we have that rates of committing certain crimes, and violent crimes are among them, are higher among African American males. Now, we also know that if you control for social class, that explains an awful lot of the differences that we see. So essentially, people who come from poverty-stricken neighborhoods, and particularly neighborhoods of intense poverty, have much higher rates of all sorts of social ills, with crime being one of them. Now, what's particularly important to note here, I think, is that generally speaking, aside from African Americans, most other people in the United States, even if they're living in poverty, do not live in such high concentrations of poverty. And all the social science research tells us that it's when you have that magnifying effect that you see all these social ills come out in such large ways. So racial housing segregation ends up creating a host of other social ills. How else do you come in the criminal justice system? Well, we all know about driving while black now. It's received a lot of attention in recent years. It's been something that's been going on for 50 years or more, but it's only come to public attention. Clearly, most African American drivers stopped when they're driving up and down the New Jersey Turnpike have not been doing anything wrong, and yet based on a racial profile, they're brought into the system. For many of them, they're only stopped by the police, and yet I think what we overlook is the fact that the interaction with the police for somebody who's not committing any crime whatsoever is certainly not very good in terms of law enforcement relations with communities. So people come in the system in different ways, partly because of higher crime rates, partly because of police activity. In recent years, most significantly, the war on drugs. Since 1980, that's been the most significant factor leading to the rise in the prison system, and we've seen a devastating impact on African Americans in particular. And this comes about through several trends. First, we see an enormous increase in number of arrests. We now have 3 times as many people arrested for drugs as we did 15 years ago. And at the same time, increasing proportions of those arrests are from African Americans. Now, we know from the best government surveys that drug use, drug abuse cut across class and racial lines, but law enforcement is much more focused in low-income communities, in minority communities. So essentially, a black drug user is more likely to come into the system than a white drug user. So why is that? Well, partly it depends where the police patrol, and the more police activity you have in a neighborhood, the more you're likely to find problems, and that's true of any neighborhood. It also has a lot to do with resources, too. In middle-class communities, when parents have a kid who's got a drug problem, they don't call up the police, they don't call up the prison warden and say, would you lock my kid up for 5 years on a mandatory prison sentence to take care of the problem? Instead, they do what any good middle-class parent would do. They get out their health insurance card, they get their kid into a treatment program, and if that doesn't work, they find another treatment program, another one. So the criminal justice system doesn't even enter into the equation. It's not a part of it. In low-income communities, it's much more likely to be defined as a crime problem because those resources aren't available. So we have the same kind of problem, but 2 very different approaches depending on where you sit in society, what kind of resources you bring to the system with you. Finally, of course, we have sentencing policies and actors in the system who may have a racial impact in their decision making. Now, we've seen some very substantial changes in the criminal justice system in the last 30 years as a result of the civil rights revolution and other changes. The personnel in the system are much more diverse than they used to be. It's now not unusual in large cities to walk in and see an African American or Hispanic judge or prosecutor or defense attorney where we wouldn't have seen that 30 years ago. And yet many of the dynamics still continue very much in the same ways. When it comes to sentencing policy, many people are familiar with the distinction between crack cocaine and powder cocaine at the federal level. Mr. Lundgren is proud of the fact that he's one of the authors of that bill. Essentially, it means that if you're caught with 499 grams of powder cocaine, if you're a big-time dealer in that, the most you will get in prison is 1 year. But yet, when that powder cocaine is broken down, mixed with baking soda, and distributed in 5-gram units on the street, anybody caught with 5 grams will get a mandatory 5 years in prison. Well, the people arrested and prosecuted for those 5 grams of crack cocaine, 85% of them are African Americans serving mandatory mandatory 5-year prison terms now. For powder cocaine, it's far more likely the offender is going to be white. Now, was racial motivation part of what happened back in 1986, 1988? It's hard to know. Certainly the image of the crack user, which we now know was very off base, was that of a young black urban male. And there was this real almost hysteria in Congress at the time to pass these draconian laws. There was no discussion whatsoever about the impact of the penalties, any other approaches that might be possible. And now we've got thousands of people serving these sentences, many of them low-level drug users, drug addicts, punished by these mandatory terms.
Mr. Lundgren, you have a response to that?
Well, just on the anecdote of what we did in 1986, 1988, I remember it very well. It was a liberal member of Congress who came to us who represented an African-American community, told us that the leadership of that community thought that their communities were being devastated by crack cocaine and demanded that we do something by way of increasing the penalty for crack cocaine relative to everything else. I would be willing, if I were still in the Congress, to revisit that issue because you could see whether or not it's had a disproportionate effect. But it was not a racial discrimination. It was based on cries from the community to do something to save their communities from the devastation done by those communities. I'm not making it up. I'm not speculating as to what happened. I was in the room. I remember very well when it came about. But look, I'm not a social scientist. I'm a practitioner in politics, in the law, and I've been very much involved in the criminal justice system, and I deal with people as I find them. The fact of the matter is that most crime in America is within the same race. It's black on black, white on white, Hispanic on Hispanic. Absolute fact. Every study shows that. To me, when I look at those figures about disproportionate number of blacks in the criminal justice system, I think of the victims. That means we have a disproportionate number of people in America who are African American who are victimized by violent crime versus whites in America. Same thing with Hispanics. And it seems to me we ought to be dealing with that particular question. I was speaking to a Safe Schools conference on a campus in Los Angeles, a high school campus. And among others, I had a mother, African-American mother, who was appearing with me, who had lost her son on that campus, shot dead on that campus when she was told that was a safe campus. We talked about the things we were doing in terms of penalizing young people who'd bring weapons to campus, zero tolerance and so forth. And when all of this was over, a 14-year-old or 15-year-old African-American female came up to me and said, "I'm so glad you're doing something now, but tell me this, how come you adults had to wait till one of my classmates was killed before you did something?" I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about victimization in the streets and what is happening out there. I mean, I don't know what all the reasons are. I think the breakdown of the family structure has been one of the greatest reasons for crime in the United States. But, I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you get a call, you're a cop, or you're a prosecutor, you get a call and someone is lying on the street and they've been shot, they don't say to me, "Doggone, find out the sociological background of that person who shot me." They say, find that person, arrest that person, convict that person, punish that person. And society owes that to them. And the fact of the matter is, there have been studies done that show the racial identification of the predator or the criminal from the standpoint of the victim. That is, you compare victimization reports with arrest reports. And the only studies that I am knowledgeable of show that racially they seem to match up pretty well, which means it is not cops going out and arresting people because of race. It is responding to the description given to them by the victim in our society. And so that ought to be one of our concerns. Why do we have this level of violence in our society when we're attempting to respond to it? All I can say is I've never yet found someone, when they call as a victim of crime, to do anything other than to cry out for help right now. And at the very least, we can say to them, we don't know what all the root causes of crime are, but we can certainly try and protect you better, and we can certainly fulfill our obligation to find that person who victimized you. If you don't do that, you're not doing justice to those folks.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis, would you like to address that? Or
Would I?
Just thought you might.
Thank you so much. I think that you don't have to be a social scientist to know that the root cause of crime is poverty. Everybody knows it. evidence is probably still not out. The jury hasn't come back on it yet. You can bet your last dollar that if you take poor people and you give them meaningful training and viable employment and decent wages, level of crime is going to go down. Common sense. And I think what we really need to do in the criminal justice discussion in the broader society is we need to really kind of bring some common sense to criminal justice. I think it's absolutely ludicrous to look at the criminal justice system and look at the disproportionate numbers of people of color and poor people in the system and not be able to, in the very vaguest sense, say what the reasons for this could be. Edward Bennett, who formerly was the head of the DEA, commissioned a study to determine who the drug users and the drug sellers in America were. And what they found out was that majority of people who sell drugs in America don't look like me. You look like y'all. Middle class, they're white and they live in the suburbs. Make $25,000 a year or more. Majority of people who use drugs in America are white. Majority of people who sell drugs in America are white. But when it comes to arrest and conviction for sale or use of drugs, 92% of all the people arrested for sale or use of drugs are Latino or black. Now, I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I spent half my life in prison, so you can't take, my word is not the testament. And you don't have to be a genius to figure out that something maybe not quite, as my Jewish friends would say, kosher. In the criminal justice system, at every junction, at almost every junction, where there is a critical decision to be made, from the inception of the surveillance to the final determination about a parole release, almost inevitably, the decision maker is white, and the person who the decision is being made upon is not. So when a police officer makes a decision as to whether to stop or frisk a person, whether that person is suspicious or not, there's a certain, I think, bias that creeps in. Has to be. Otherwise, how would you account for this? I read the other day that this young kid wanted to get some Pokemon cards. You familiar with the Pokemon phenomenon? Broke into a department store and tried to hijack the Pokemon cards. Little white kid. Got locked in the place, couldn't get out, had to call 911. They came and rescued him. You know what they charged him with? Wasn't breaking and entering, wasn't illegal trespass, wasn't burglary one, juvenile delinquency. That kid was black, what do you think they would have done to him? Or Latino, or poor. Burglary one, breaking and entering. If he was 11 years old, they would have tried him as an adult, and they would have probably asked for the death penalty. There is some irrationality that is driving this insanity. This 11-year-old kid in the woods with a rifle shot a guy in the head. And they waited 2 years till he was 13, and then they tried him as an adult and convicted him. Second-degree murder, maybe, or manslaughter, I don't remember what the conviction was. And the rationale was that at 13 years old, he understood the consequences of his actions. Well, if that's true, let me just make this point. If that's true, we should let 13-year-olds vote. We should let 13-year-olds drink. We should let 13-year-olds drive. We should put them in the Army. And most of all, we should put them on juries so that the other 13-year-olds can have a jury of their peers.
Mr. Lundgren, let me focus our attention on the prison industry. We all know the prison industry is booming, and in 1996, it's recorded that the state spent $22 billion on prisons, with the average annual operating expenditure per inmate at $20,000. Many powerful groups clearly have a big financial stake in the prison industry. How large a role does this play in our current sentencing policies?
I mean, I can't say. All I can say is what impact did it have on me when I was in the Congress voting on it. I never gave a thought to it. I never had someone in the prison system come and talk to me. Now, I talked to the people who ran the prison system, but not those who built the system, not those who were contractors, not those who were involved in that whatsoever. In California, it is true that one of the largest unions, most powerful unions, is the Correctional Peace Officers Association, which I might add did not support me for governor last time around. Sometimes as Attorney General you have to investigate possibilities of brutality, but I'm sure that had no effect on their decision as to whether or not they were going to endorse. It is probably the strongest single union in public union in California, and some would suggest therefore they have all this sway. I found this with respect to their policy. They have actually promoted some alternatives to incarceration, where they have probably done the most in terms of true lobbying, where they've had an impact, is to keep out the privatization of prisons in California. That's where I've seen the most direct impact. I am one of those who, I'm very leery of privatization of prisons for the reason that the government has the only legitimate entity in this society that can take my freedom away or your freedom away. Therefore, I don't think they ought to subcontract that ability to do it. That's just a feeling of liberty for me. And so I don't support that notion. But I would say that the prison guards union in California is strong on that specific area. Are they strong in influencing the creation of prisons? I haven't found that so much as if you're going to make good on your promises in increasing penalties, then you got to increase your prisons. Now, they do support that. Interesting point I would just throw out, a lot of people aren't aware of. In California, I don't know what it is in the other states, where people are talking about these draconian things that we're doing. If you're a convicted felon, your chance of going to state prison are less than 1 in 4. Only about 23% of convicted felons in California go to state prison. The rest of them get credit for time served or go on some sort of probation. So when we're talking about this system that's out there, folks, most felons don't go to state prison. They go to some other type of situation, most likely probation.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis, would you address that question?
Yeah, I think that, you know, it's interesting, if you listen close enough and you hang around long enough, eventually you can come to some areas of agreement. And I agree with the Attorney General, former Attorney General, that privatization certainly is not the way to go when we talk about liberty interest. But I think that the massive buildup of prisons is fueled by the profit motive. There's a lot of money in prisons. And that motive, that incentive, you know, the people who cry the most about crime in New York, I don't know how it is in California, but I probably bet most of the family jewelry that people who cry the most about crime in New York, the legislators, don't have any crime in the area. Very low incidence of crime. But what they're really crying for is to have a prison built in their backyard, because prisons bring economic booms. Prisons bring economic prosperity. Prisons bring, you know what prisons bring? Prisons bring shopping malls. So you build a prison, and within 5 years, within a 30-mile radius of that prison, there's going to be a shopping mall. In New York, all of the places that, and I think it's true in California, almost all of the places that they chose to build the prisons were rural, economically depressed counties. And once they built the prison in those rurally, economically depressed counties, everybody in the county received an enormous amount of prosperity, and the economic devastation that was caused by the declining in small family farms and the flight of manufacturing overseas and a number of other kinds of, you know, economic things that I really don't understand, seem to have been supplemented by the building of these prisons. The #1 lobbyist in America for prisons, not the prison guards, the American Architectural Association. And they build and construct these prisons almost the way that they do cars, with a kind of a limited planned obsolescence. So if you look at the If you look at the Correctional Association of America magazine, every month which comes out, you see these ads for the latest technological hardware and software that go into the prisons. Prison guards in the United States are the highest unpaid, highest unskilled workers in the world. There's no way you can go and get the kind of salary and fringe benefits that you get by being a prison guard. So there's an enormous profit involved, and I think that drives, and which is capitalism, and that's the American way. So we shouldn't be complaining about this. Thank you.
Mr. Maurer, would you mind addressing that, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions.
Sure. Well, I also agree that I don't think that the private prison interests themselves have been the ones pushing tough sentencing legislation. If you talk to some of the people in the private prison industry, they basically tell you, no, the politicians are doing all our work for us. They don't need our money to be doing this sort of thing, and I think that's absolutely true. I think there are some pretty complex relationships, though, between the fiscal realities of criminal justice and what's been going on, what the systems look like. Eddie points out that we've had this resurgence of prison building in rural areas in particular. Now, there was a time 20 or 25 years ago where if the state corrections director came to a small town and said, I want to build a prison here, he or she would have been booted out of there in day one or so. They didn't want a prison. They didn't want these criminals escaping in their community and things like that. Now they're actively lobbying legislators to build them a prison because they view it as a source of guaranteed employment for the next 50 years. And what we have to look forward to as well is if we ever were to reach a point where, as a society, we decided maybe we don't need to keep locking up so many people, we're going to have an enormous sort of institutionalized lobbying force represented by all the prison workers, the communities affected by it, all these small towns across the country, and the last thing in the world they will want to do is to close down their major source of employment. So I think it is a real threat or a real issue for us to be concerned about. Now, economics it fits into in other ways as well. California certainly is one of the best examples. This enormous prison boom that they've had has cut into funding for higher education and other kinds of services. We see this around the country too. And the sad fact is you can't have it both ways. You can't say we want to build as many prisons as we can, but we also want to invest in prevention. There is a trade-off, and we need to be looking at that. Finally, I just want to respond. Mr. Lundgren is talking about the fact that not all the felons in California go to prison. Well, there's a couple of problems here. First of all, why is the assumption that all the felons should go to prison? Should a first-time car thief, a first-time drug user automatically go to prison for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years? Is that a responsible thing to do for the taxpayers? Secondly, many of the people going to prison are going on some what I would consider to be bizarre charges. The Supreme Court earlier this year upheld a 3 strikes and you're out law of 25 years to life for a man whose third conviction was stealing a $20 bottle of vitamins from a grocery store. Now, was he a habitual offender? Absolutely. He had 2 prior strikes, so that qualified him for this third strike. He'd already done his time. He'd been punished for his prior strikes, and now the politicians and people of California have decided that they would rather spend $500,000 for this $20 bottle of vitamins than invest in their schools, invest in probation officers, drug treatment, or something else like that. I don't think that's the way it was framed on the ballot, but essentially that's the trade-off, and so it does come down to a question of economics, I think.
Okay, we're going to take questions from the floor, and as you can see, there are 2 microphones on the bottom and 2 microphones up the next level. So I will rotate around, and I just want to remind the audience, if you would open with your name and your affiliation, and also remember that a question is an inquiry that invites a reply. Yes.
Hi, I'm Tal Clement. I'm an MPP JD. And my question speaks to something that Attorney General Lundgren brought up, which was that most crime, you said, occurs black on black, white on white, right, between races. I'm wondering, how is that addressed, intra-race? I'm wondering, how is that addressed by taking all of a specific group and incapacitating them or putting them in another setting? Does that mean that crime between those people who were perhaps shooting each other or killing each other in inner cities somehow disappears within the correctional system, or is there crime in the correctional system? Is there drug use in the correctional system? Is there a gang problem in the correctional system? So I'm wondering, how does that fit with your argument that you're actually taking into account the victims when really maybe what you're doing is moving the victims and removing them from society?
You're not going to get me to suggest that I, in any way, countenance crime that goes on in the prisons. Is it a reality? Yes, it is. Should we do more to try and ferret it out? Yes. Do we need to spend more money to try and make our prisons more humane? Yes, I would argue that we do. But what I'm talking about is the vast majority of people who haven't committed a crime, never been charged with a crime, and who are the innocents among us. It makes it appreciably safer. The fact of the matter is, if you compare the crime rate that existed in California before 3 strikes to the crime rate now, and you calculate the number of crimes that would have been committed had the prior rate continued for these last 5 years, we need about 10 Rose Bowls to take care of all the people who would have been victimized. Over 1 million crimes not committed during that period of time. What's the value of that? I mean, I hear this talk about $27,000, $25,000. Actually, that's a little low for Harvard here. I found that out. I couldn't afford to come here either. Yeah. Although I know some judges who would think that if you were sentenced to Harvard, that'd be cruel and unusual punishment. But the fact of the matter is, you have to figure out what the cost savings are to society. And if you are specifically targeting a good part of your program against career criminals, there's at least one study that suggests that the mean number of crimes they commit per year is 187. You take a career criminal off some as low as 12, whatever you want to call it.
The median is 12, and you're at Harvard, you should know that between a median and an average. That is a very important point.
12 and 187 mean, I think.
The mean is meaningless.
No, the mean isn't meaningless, but in any event, whether it's 12, which is on the low side, up to 187 suggested in some self-reports that have taken place, those are multiple crimes committed by a single individual. You ought not to be surprised that you have a major impact on the crime rate, having it go down if you have successfully targeted your program at career criminals. So, is your question, am I concerned about victims and how does this impact victims? You take people off the street who are multiple offenders, and the chances are that number of people who would otherwise be victimized by them are not victimized. That increases a sense of security and a sense of safety in the community.
Mr. Maurer, do you want to respond to this question as well, briefly?
Well, unfortunately, I think that's very irresponsible. The study he's quoting from is by an economist named Edwin Zedleski from the Justice Department. It's fair to say, I believe, it came out in 1987, it's the most discredited study that's ever been produced by the Justice Department. And it's figures like this 187 crimes that get repeated in the halls of Congress every time we want to have yet another mandatory sentencing passed. It's time we started talking about real things. It's also time we stopped saying that there are victims here and offenders here. I've been victimized by crime. I've had friends who've been murdered, raped, victims of armed robbery. The reason I do this work is because I want to see crime reduced. And wanting better sentencing policies is going to lead to reduction in crime, and less likely that I will be a victim. We don't have two kinds of people. We're all in the same community.
Very briefly, I would argue, we did a study in New York real quickly. What we found out was that the majority of people in the prison system had very similar kinds of characteristics, including being unemployed at the time of crime and being undereducated and the whole substance abuse problems, a whole series of other kinds of problems. And it seems to me that that targeted group were people who lived in certain residentially segregated areas, and that in fact they have become victims themselves. And what we find in this criminal justice system is victims who are victims of societal ills victimizing other people. And we kind of make a dichotomy there and put some victims on one side and some victims on the other side, and some victims we treat a little differently than other victims. And I think that if we look at the overall picture, that we have to begin to construct some policies that take into consideration not just the nature of the crime and the nature of the offender, but also some of these other kinds of factors.
Thank you.
Wait a second. I mean, look, I did not misstate anything. I said the mean was 187. The average, according to the report, was 12. Unless you are here to say, that there are no people who are in fact career criminals who commit a disproportionate amount of crime, the point is you do have a group of people, relatively small among the criminal population, who commit a considerable amount of crime. Therefore, that is a public policy imperative to deal with. And if you are going to ignore those
people,
people,
be locked up. You don't need 3 strikes and you're out to catch the ones doing 187 crimes a year. They get themselves locked up pretty quickly.
No, the fact of the matter is, what has happened in the past, they get themselves locked out, they then go out for recess for a few years, they come back in. What we've basically done is canceled recess. They stay in, and they're not out there victimizing other people out there.
What we really should be doing, though, is when we got them locked up, we should be doing something with them at that point, so when they come out, we don't have to worry about them coming back in.
Hey, I'll be happy to work with you on getting an anti-drug program in our prison.
I'm talking about anti-drug program.
Well, sure.
I'm talking about education.
I'm also talking about anti-drug, so they can be in a position so they can take advantage of that education. You can't ignore one part of the problem.
Is this an offer to work together on?
I love it.
I've always suggested that ought to be one of the things we ought to do.
We'll continue that conversation. Let's take a question from this side.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Sarah Lucas. I'm also an MVP from the Kennedy School. I'd like to thank you guys for being here, and also I have a question for Dan Lundgren. In citing the failure of rehabilitation policy in California to solve the crime problem, I'm wondering if the financial commitment per criminal for rehabilitation was equal to what it would have been for incarceration.
Oh, good question.
And the second part of this question is directed to the entire panel, which is, what would effective rehabilitation policy consist of? What kind of commitments do we need to make towards that?
Well, I support rehabilitation programs, but if you've got a limited number of dollars, and the question is, you can only spend so much money, and you're not going to spend it on incarcerating people who are otherwise out there victimizing folks, I'm going to spend those dollars to at least get them off the street, so at least you incapacitate them from the ability to do crime while they're in there. I would like to see deterrence. I would like to see rehabilitation. I'd like to see incapacitation. But if I only have a limited number of dollars and I'm either going to do nothing or something, at the very least, I owe it to someone who calls me and says, I've been victimized by crime, to say, we owe it to you to take that person off the street who's committed that crime, if we're talking about a violent crime, who has done that to you. I don't want vengeance in the street. I don't want people out there trying to make their own justice. They rely on the government somehow to, first of all, try and create conditions that would protect them, and secondly, if they fail, to try and at least get that person who committed that crime against them and have that person at least visited with some just deserts.
Yeah, I would say 70% of the people in the prison system or more are in the prison system because of nonviolent crimes. And when there were no victims, but we're still locking them up in increasingly large numbers. I don't have a problem with locking people up. I believe that if it made society safer, if it made you and I safer in our homes, if we could eliminate crime in the streets, I would lock all criminals up. I've been in 25 years I spent in prison, and I can tell you there are some people that deserve to be in prison, should be in prison, and should never go home. But that is a very, very small percentage. I think also that once a person goes into the prison system, something should take place in that system other than punishment, because that doesn't work. Something should take place in that system so that when that person comes out, after we spend $25,000 a year to keep him in there, something should happen so when that person comes out, they come out in better shape than when they went in, and public safety is enhanced. And if that doesn't happen, then I think that prisons are failures, and it's not happening, so prisons are failures. Let me just say this real quick. While I was in prison, I was able to further my education. I got a master's degree, I got a bachelor's degree. There was a study done, Justice Department did a study to find out what was the singular most effective means of reducing recidivism. Lo and behold, what was it? Education. Genius could have told you that, right? So what do? We effectively eliminated all college-level educational programs in the United States for ex-felons. So we took the singular, most important, and most successful program at reducing recidivism and eliminated it. Now, anybody that does that in in the name of public safety is either crazy or I'm crazy. And anybody that supports that kind of position, it seems to me, is bordering on irrationality. And this gets back to what I was saying about common sense and criminal justice. Until and unless we're able to kind of weed through some of the built-in biases and some of the built-in fears and some of the racial prejudices and all that other sort of thing, and get to a point of common sense, then I think the rest of the discussion is kind of futile.
Would you like very briefly to respond, and then we're going to take a question from the balcony?
Just a couple quick things. First, yes, we do know some things that would work. We know that education in prison can work. I suppose that's why Congress in 1994 said that prisoners couldn't get Pell Grants to continue their college education. Maybe they're afraid it might work. We know that drug treatment can work if it's high-quality residential treatment. You're now far less likely to get drug treatment in prison than you were just 8 years ago. So that has been cut as well. The other problem is that we're looking at the criminal justice system. It's a reactive system, is the way it's always been premised. Mr. Lundgren says quite correctly, if somebody calls 911, you expect the police to do something. Yes, you do. But the other half of that is that the police have recognized in recent years that if you just spend all your time reacting, you're never going to get anywhere. And so that's the whole movement towards community policing, problem-solving policing, saying, why do we work with communities so we don't just sit by the phone and wait for the 911 call to come in? That's not getting anywhere. And that's a whole different approach.
Great. Do you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lynn Lyman, and I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School and a member of the criminal justice PIC that brought you here tonight. Thank you for coming. I have a book full of questions, but I'm going to start with one. And this question is for Dan Lundgren, seeing as we have to share our home state of California. As you know, in 1976, the California Penal Code was amended to replace the word rehabilitation with punishment as the primary goal of imprisonment. You've stated several times tonight that you support rehabilitation. Why, therefore, during your 8 years as Attorney General, did you do nothing to put rehabilitation back into the system?
Oh, I never suggested we ought not to have rehabilitation. I've said all along, virtually every public statement I ever made. However, I've said this: we do not know for sure exactly how to rehabilitate. We do know that we can give opportunity for rehabilitation. I give the example of a vocational teacher at one of our prisons in the Central Valley who came up to me, I never met him before, and thanked me for 3 strikes. I said, why? He said, it's the single most effective thing that I've had in 16 years of teaching vocational ed in the prison system. I said, what do you mean? He said, now they come to me and they say, you've really got to teach me something because I don't want to come back in here. The fact of the matter is, punishment is the linchpin of the criminal justice system. Other things around it can be assisted by it. But if you take away punishment as a proper social goal, and you put it to the side such that it is not, I mean, you can laugh if you want to. We went through a 40-year experiment. We tried the other approach for 20 solid years in California. We took punishment out and we put rehabilitation at the front of the line. And crime almost quadrupled. We had more rapes, more robberies, more assaults than we'd ever had before. And so we then changed it starting in the 80s, and we saw plateauing off, and we have seen a significant drop. So I'm not going to apologize for what I did. I was part of the effort to try and reinstitute punishment as the #1 goal of the criminal justice system because we tried the other way, which apparently is your way, and it failed for 20 years.
There's an inherent contradiction in your statement. What I'm asking is, tonight you stated that you support rehabilitation. In your statements now, you're saying you do not think that's effective. Please state your position clearly for us.
No, I said it is not effective as the primary goal of the system. That's what I said. What happened in the past is when we made it the primary goal, punishment fell by the wayside. I believe as a direct result of that, we had fewer and fewer rates of incarceration. I mean, I can show you the chart that will show as the crime rate went up, incarceration rates went down. The number in the state of California remained about the same. Crime rate was going up, population was going up, same number of people in the system itself. It acted just in the opposite direction. So looking at that experiment for 20 years, and I don't question the sincerity of anybody who tried that. We tried it. But when it's proven to be wrong, why go back to something that absolutely failed? I'd like to see a system that has punishment. Acceptance of responsibility for what you've done, I think, is the first thing you have to do. Surround people with opportunities for rehabilitation, but knowing that they are being punished. They accept that punishment for what they have done. And the third thing is, make sure you have to go through, I'd even do it upon arrest for serious felonies, require them to go through a drug evaluation. And if in fact it shows that they are drug dependent, require that as part of whatever else happens in the system. And if they can pay for it, fine. If they can't pay for it, have the taxpayers pay for it to help them at least get off that. That's not going to solve all the problems, but I think it would make a tremendous dent in them.
Mr. Ellis wants a very brief response.
Yeah. Very briefly, I would be in favor of mandatory drug testing for everybody in America if we want to do some drug testing. And then based on that, we could then determine who needs to be in programs and who doesn't. But let me say this about rehabilitation. And again, I preface it because I don't know what the California experience is, but I've talked to enough people who are in California prisons, and I know enough people who were in prisons, and I was in prison myself, as I say, over and over and over again, to know that at the time, can I just give a little historical perspective here?
Very briefly.
Real quick.
We have a line.
Rehabilitation came into being after the massacre at Attica in 1971. That focused the spotlight on prisons, and as a result of that focus the spotlight, the whole way in which prisons were run began to shift. From 1971 until 1985, the idea of rehabilitation was an idea that was exceedingly in favor by some public policy makers. However, and the young lady that pointed that out over there was right on target. There was never a fiscal commitment made to it commensurate with the kind of fiscal commitment that we see made to punishment. Not only that, but the majority of people who worked in the prison system, the guards, the civilians, the administrators, the managers, never bought into the rehabilitation idea. So even though the public policy was that we should rehabilitate, and the stated policy was that we should be rehabilitated, in fact, inside, on the ground, where the rubber meets the road, there was no commitment to rehabilitation. There were no dollars for rehabilitation. And so consequently, it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It failed because we failed to help it not fail. So when we talk about rehabilitation and that failed experiment, we need to look at it really very carefully to see, why did it fail? And once we come up with those answers, then we'll know what we need to do to make it succeed. Lastly, punishment as a primary tool of public policy in the prisons will never, ever be effective in the long term, and that is because you can't heap enough punishment on people to overcome the relationship between crime and poverty. So what you're really doing is punishing poor people for being poor and being in prison.
Gavin Sams, Kennedy School. For the former Attorney General, I think your characterization of the issue as a problem for victims, that we need to focus on the victims, is sound, but I think somewhat incomplete. I can remember growing up always hoping that the police would come in and, of course, handle all the people who were victimizers, and they would come in and clearly arrest them. But I also remember hoping that when the police themselves were victimizers, that people would come in and do something about that, but they were never so readily arrested or reprimanded, and that created problems. So I wonder, too, about your notion of this problem of the victims and the fact that if 28% of people that look like me are being put in the system, how do we consider that a successful process unless we somehow believe that people that look like me are just predisposed to committing crime? Otherwise, you have to somehow believe that there's something that we should do that will reduce the 28% of people who are victimizing people, but maybe there's something else going on that's making this happen. So you said you had a concern, you couldn't figure out what was making people become victimizers, but to me that's the core of the problem, again, unless you think black Americans, African Americans are just predisposed to committing crime.
No, I never said that. I would reject that, absolutely. In the first instance, I would say if you have evidence of police brutality or police crime, that ought to be prosecuted. As Attorney General, I had to prosecute that. I prosecuted Mark Furman for the language that he used in the O.J. Simpson case. I prosecuted any number of people. I was given the responsibility of taking a look at tough cases in California where local jurisdictions couldn't handle it. And I prosecuted sheriffs. I put sheriffs in prison for corruption in office. I've gone against police chiefs who've done that. So I absolutely agree with you. You need to have an ability to go after people who abuse the system. Every time I spoke to law enforcement personnel, almost every time I could think about it, I said it. I said, those of you who wear the badge have to understand the awesome responsibility you have. You have the only legal right to take away the freedom of anybody in this society. You come in with the power of the state, and you better understand what that can do to an individual if you do it wrongly. I always suggested they ought to have some humility about the job they have. Because you can be wrong, and you have to be open to that. I would tell that to my prosecutors. Do you realize what happens when you go in, and you come in and you answer, you answer ready for the case. You're appearing on behalf of the people of the state of California versus so-and-so. That's pretty heavy. You know what I'm saying? And so, yes, we have to do that. On your second point, look, if I knew all the ways to handle that question, I'd be a genius. I don't know. I happen to think the breakdown of the family is across racial lines. It happens to be more pronounced in the African-American community. It's in all kinds of communities across America. It is a contributing factor to the problem. Poverty, obviously, someone would be more easily tempted if they have no money, perhaps to steal something, than if they have a lot of money, although I've seen people with a lot of money steal as well. But I think you can go back to the Depression and certain areas of our economic life, and you can see the crime rate doesn't fluctuate up and down with the economy. I don't know what all the things are, but I would say value structure, education, economic opportunity. You're not going to get people to start up businesses in crime-prone areas. So one of the first things you have to do to give opportunity for people for jobs and for creating their own work is to make it safe there. So an indispensable part of creating jobs in the inner city is making them safer than they have been. All I know is that's part of it. I can't solve all the problems. When I'm presented with a particular problem, I try and solve that to the greatest extent that I can.
I guess I'm just, real quick, I'm just saying, to characterize it, the characterization comes off as if it's a successful notion, this notion of how you have managed to make sure that the victimizers are put away. And
right.
Characterizing it as a success when 28% of African Americans, it's just, I understand your point, but it's misleading to characterize this as a success when 28% of a population. Fine, you don't know the answer, but at least give an even-handed presentation to say, we're doing what we think we can do, but it's clearly not enough because 28% of given people should not be considered victimizers on a consistent basis. There is something wrong, and the problem has not been solved.
I understand. All I can say is when I talk to victims who are African American, they thank us for trying to pursue those who victimized them, and we should all work together to try and limit the number of victimizers. I
agree, but my other point was that those same people come back and say, you also don't attack the victimizers who are police. Those same people come back and say, why are you locking up my fathers and brothers and stopping them on the street? So there's another side to the victimization part too.
Thank you. Mr. Moe?
Maybe we're talking different people. I know when I go and speak with black church groups and black community groups, yes, they say they do want more police protection. They want to get people who are terrorizing them off the streets. They also tell me they want better schools for their kids. They want summer jobs for their kids. They want more drug treatment programs. And our national policy has basically said, yes, we'll give you more cops and we'll give you more prisons. There's no shortage of money available for that. But that other stuff, you're just going to have to wait until we lock everybody up. That apparently is what the national policy is. It's not stated that way, but if one looks at the results, that's pretty much what it looks like to me.
Not only that, but to follow up on that brother's question, in New York, and I imagine the demographics are very similar in California, 87% of all the people in the state prison system, Latino or black. 93% of all the people in the county jail system in New York, black or Latino. Now, I'm like you, I don't have the answer. I couldn't imagine what that is, but I believe that black people are probably predisposed to be criminals, because that's the only thing that could possibly account, or maybe it's genetic, could be genetic.
Well, I got an idea. I'll work with you on supporting school vouchers to improve the schools in the inner city, which happens to be more strongly supported in the African American community than any other community in America.
That's absolutely not true. The only people that support vouchers, the African American community, are black preachers who have churches that have schools.
All the polling data suggests that's wrong.
We only have time for 2 more questions, so let me take one from here and one from this side.
Good evening. My name is Don DeTunaj. I'm a second-year MPP here, and actually my question is kind of related to the question came from the top, and it's to Mr. Lundgren.
Ask these guys.
We should spread the wealth here.
Okay. Actually, I want to ask a question. I want to probe you a little bit about institutionalized racist perceptions of crime.
Yeah.
And I think your comments tonight perpetuate that image when you use criminal and predator interchangeable, and I wonder if you recognize that when you use language like that, you demonize criminal conduct. You demonize a person, not the criminal conduct, that it makes it easier for you to think that you're doing something to fight crime when you look after the predator, which results in policies that lock up, surveil, incarcerate, and try more people of color than white people. And I would ask you, do you not think the 1 in 2 women that are abused domestically, is that not crime or violent crime? Do you not think the police officer that arrested me and made me spend the night in jail did not commit a crime when he battered me and falsely imprisoned me? But your policies by identifying these people as predators, I think, conjures up images of black people, people of color, and I don't think that you're recognizing that the people who drink on these Ivy League campuses, that's criminal conduct also. The woman who dates an Ivy League undergrad, who rapes her or forces her into sexual intercourse, that also is criminal conduct. But the more you use language like predator, and people preying and victimizers, it makes it harder for people who are married to men who abuse them to report that as criminal conduct. And I think that's the reason why we have a disproportionate number of people being incarcerated.
I'm very careful, you know, so I don't use language like animals and that sort of stuff that I hear some people use. I think someone, and I normally can find, I've heard that used when people say that.
Most predators are animals. So when you use that language predator, the time that I learned about predator was involving animals that were wild.
I use the word predator, usually more limited than I did today. I use the word predator to talk about the career criminals, because I think they are predators. They are by definition multiple offenders, and they are predators in the sense of their action against victims. It may be an inappropriate term to use for someone who commits a single crime at one time, but I don't back away from the idea of using the word predators. I've talked with victims who feel that way. You're not going to get me up here to excuse the conduct of somebody who's white or whatever who commits a rape against a woman. I mean, I've never suggested anything like that. I had more programs dealing with victimization of women than any attorney general in the past. I mean, I tried to bring we passed new laws that brought tougher and tougher sanctions against those who violated women. We changed the law so that you could bring evidence years afterwards for those kinds of crime. We allowed certain evidence of patterns of conduct in sexual assault cases. I worked to increase the penalties against those who attack women. So, I mean, I don't have to suggest to you that I take those crimes any less seriously than I do other violent crimes. If you're offended by the use of the word predator, I'm sorry, I don't use it in terms of identifying anybody racially. You could be a white predator, a Hispanic predator, an Asian predator, black predator. I think certain kinds of conduct by multiple offenders does rise to that level that I feel very comfortable calling that individual predator.
Can I respond to that real quickly? I think that, and I don't want to put words in the brother's mouth, but I think that part of what's happened in America in the discourse about criminal justice is that we've identified people of color and poor people generally, but mostly blacks and Latinos, and probably predominantly blacks. And when we talk about criminal, we talk about predators, and we talk about all of those other adjectives that we use to describe the so-called criminal element, there is a certain media-driven picture that comes into our minds. I think essentially what the brother's saying is that that we do a disservice to people of color and to poor people and to people who we put those kinds of labels on. And when we put a label like predator on someone, we reduce that person from a human being to some lesser state. And once we reduce that person, once we marginalize that person, then whatever we do to them is okay. Whatever you do to a predator, 3 strikes, 4 strikes, 10 strikes, whatever, death penalty, whatever. And I think that in that process there is some very serious dangers built into the language. And I think that it may be cultural, maybe some cultural dissonance going on here. But I think that what he's saying, and I agree with him, and I would say it also, that you need to be really very careful when you start using those kind of labels, because essentially, even though you may not in your mind mean black people or Latino people or people of color, the listener takes it to mean that. And I think that's a serious mistake.
Let me just say quickly, I appreciate your comment, and I fully agree with it as well. I think we can see very clearly what some of the political implications are. There was some talk in the early 90s about a coming generation of super predators. John DiIulio was one of the key proponents of this, and he described this as a group of godless, fatherless, jobless kids or something like that, and they were going to unleash a crime wave that was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. Well, what happened? Well, lo and behold, juvenile crime rates started plummeting, almost immediately after he came out with this pronouncement. And all the serious research shows that there's nothing going on there. It doesn't stop Congress from trying to pass tougher laws based on this mythology. But think about what it means as well. He was talking, and his allies, about this coming generation. So essentially, this is a group of 5-year-old boys. I would agree with Eddie. I think he was talking about African-American boys. But whether or not he was, it was a group of 5-year-old boys, coming generation. They were going to start at the age of 15, 16, 17, committing high rates of crime. So what should we do about this problem? Well, we have two choices. We could start to build prisons now so we could lock them all up when they turn 15, or we could do what I would do with my kids. If you have a 5-year-old with a problem, you deal with the problem. And yet the overriding policy proposal has been to build prisons so we can get ready to lock these kids up. That's what we do with super predators.
And lower the age at which you can treat them as adults. So we take 11-year-olds and we treat them as adults. And if the policy continues and it's legitimate, we're going to have 4 or 5-year-old kids that we're treating as adults because they're super predators.
Well, let me just say something. I was one of those who spoke out against the notion of super predators.
Thank you.
I spoke out against the notion that it was inevitable. I talked about having programs that would stop this sort of thing from happening. I talked about education, better education. I talked about role models and values out there. But I also got in trouble in some areas because I was talking about things of the dominant culture exacerbating the problem, all the way from violent video games, which affect all kids, to violent images presented to our kids in television and in the movies, to all the sorts of things that are surrounding our kids and inculcating in them a sense of insensitivity to doing pain to others. So I agree with you, and I never accepted the idea of super predators because it was accepted as an inevitability. I don't care what race they are, I don't care what color those kids are, we shouldn't give up on those kids.
Yes, our last question.
Hi, my name is Danya Palanker. I'm a student at the Kennedy School, and my question's for all the panelists. It's what role you feel gun control has in reducing crime and therefore incarceration, and for those of you who don't believe in gun control, how you justify that to the victims of gun crime who don't just want the perpetrators of crime in prison, but want to prevent the gun violence from happening to others as well.
I definitely believe in gun control. I think that there's some really unique legislation that's coming up, or that's at least being talked about, in which gun manufacturers are going to be held liable for some other kinds of things. I'm not sure what the implications of all those things are, and I support anything that removes dangerous weapons from the street, from the hands of anybody that may use them illegally. I think that, Rap Brown in the 1960s, many of you are probably too young to remember who Rap Brown was, but there was a famous activist. All of these older guys could bear witness to that. But Rap Brown said that violence is as American as apple pie, and it's true. And part of, I think, what Mr. Lundgren was talking about in terms of the culture of America, all of our heroes, from George Washington to John Gotti, were people who resolved conflicts violently with weapons. That's the American way. And if you're not into that, ride tall in the saddle with your gun slung low, then you are un-American, and that's not going to be tolerated for a long time. All of our heroes, all of the mythology of America is a mythology that supports the idea that might makes right. And we got a problem anywhere in the world, we send in the Marines, they kick their ass and straighten this business right out. Every Sunday on TV, we see the analogy between the football teams and war and all that sort of stuff. So we wonder, after having bombarded our kids with that, all of our heroes, all of our multimedia heroes, Al Capone and John Dillinger and Daniel Crockett and David Boone and you name them, ad infinitum, are people who use weapons to settle problems. given that bombardment of cultural crap, it's no wonder that we're having a serious problem with guns. And on top of that, we've got the most powerful lobby in America fighting to keep and to produce more and more weapons. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that we have all of these kinds of problems. And I think that the problems are so systemic that we need to approach it in ways that are far more radical than what we're talking about now, you know. We maybe need to abolish guns rather than gun control.
I'm confused, Eddie. At first I was flattered that you agreed with me, and then as you started talking I was a little worried. I've never, moral relativism, putting John Gotti and George Washington together, I've never seen them both considered heroes. I think I agree with your fundamental proposition, which is that we have an inculcation of violence in our society, but I would suggest that some of our founding fathers had it in the context of justice and so forth, but that's another point.
That's questionable in my mind.
Well, I can see how some of you can applaud here. I mean, the fact that we live in the freest society in the history of the world that's given more opportunity for more people, for freedom of expression, for practice of your religion, and yet you get a clap when you suggest that. But
my suggestion is based
let
me clarify.
No.
My suggestion is based on the fact that most of the founding fathers were slave owners, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
I understand that.
That's what my suggestion was.
I understand that, and the fact is they committed themselves to principles which resulted in the abolition of slavery and the greatest extent of freedom in the history of the world. But I know it's not fashionable at times to suggest that because they were old dead white men. But you know, I happen to think Western civilization actually is a good. I think America's a good. I think America has probably been a force for good more than any other country in the world. That may not be something that people want to talk about here, but that's all right. I don't mind being in a minority here if that's what's required. On gun control, I stand before you as someone who got an F from the NRA on the one hand and had the LA Times beating my head in because I was too much pro-gun. I'm for what I call reasonable gun control. I was one of the few Republican members who supported the Brady Bill. I enforced the California version of the Brady Bill. I stopped 35,000 purchases of weapons while I was there. I started a special unit going after felons who had guns that they weren't supposed to have. We took tens of thousands of guns off the street. We did arrest and we did prosecute successfully some of those individuals. I support a limitation on the size of the clip. I was at 101 California Avenue 50 minutes before that crazed gunman went in and killed a number of people at a law firm. I had lunch with two of those people just before he came in. Had I remained there, I might have been a victim. He had two 50-round clips, one to each of the semi-automatic weapons he had slung over his shoulder. I support limitation of the...
Why not abolition?
Abolition of what?
Guns.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to say to someone who happens to be in a crime-prone area that she doesn't have a right to have a weapon to defend herself, number one. Number two, there is something called the Second Amendment of the Constitution, unless you want to totally ignore that. And number three, I think a lot of people are responsible with their use of weapons. I don't choose to have a weapon myself, nor do any members of my family, but I think others have used it responsibly. I support reasonable gun legislation, and I support one thing that Eddie probably doesn't agree with. It's called 10-20 life. That is, if you use a weapon in the commission of a felony, you get 10 extra years. If you discharge that weapon in the commission of a serious or violent felony, you get 20, and if you do grave bodily injury to someone by the discharge of that weapon, you get 25 years to life. It seems to me that ought to be directed at the people who use the weapons in the commission of a felony. That's the most effective gun control.
Our last comment is from Mr. Maurer.
Yeah, well, just a couple quick things. You know, most of you know there was another school shooting in Oklahoma today. A 13-year-old kid, I think, walks in and starts shooting at some kids he knows. I happened to see a 2-minute piece about it on CNN, and you know, it's the same thing you see all the time. There's parents and neighbors saying he was such a good kid, we can't understand why he did it, we don't know, who would have guessed it would have come to our community, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the piece, then our reporter basically looks at the camera and says, and people in this community are still asking why. Well, I was asking, why did he have a gun, and where did he get the gun from? Not a word about that in the first place and stuff. Why does a 13-year-old kid have access to this gun? So we have a serious problem, clearly, that he's having access to his gun, and that the television people aren't even asking that question. If he didn't have access to a gun, this is not a national news story. He goes in the lunchroom and he has a fight, and kids have fights every day in their lunchrooms, and it doesn't become national news. So clearly, we need a change in all different kinds of levelness. You know, it's particularly bizarre talking about it sometimes. You remember several years ago in Scotland, there was a town, gunman goes into a schoolyard, kills 16 people. Overnight, gun laws change there and stuff, and yet we become, you know, almost immune to it and stuff. And after a while, well, this kid was only, you know, he only killed 4 kids or attacked 4 kids, that sort of thing. All right.
I hear a sequel in the making. Maybe it's a spring sequel. Gun control, or as you all know, that Mayor Koch has lined up with Louis Farrakhan for Second Chance, and maybe we can get some opportunities for partnerships in the future on these issues. But most of all, let me please thank those students who organized this: Tal Clement, Elizabeth Siggins, Karina Moreno, and several others whose name I don't have with me. Thank you very much.
You should maybe call them up so they could...
Yeah, would you all come up? Mr. Ellis has made a fine suggestion. With those students who organized it, please come up, while we also thank Mr. Maurer, Mr. Ellis, and Mr. Lundgren for a very fine job.
I guess the students are afraid to come up.
Come on. They're afraid to come up. Very good job. Thank you.
All right.
Good night. Good night.
Provocative.